I was holding a dead man in my arms when I felt my own body slip off me like a wet coat. He had been alive 30 seconds earlier. 30 seconds. Long enough for him to finish a joke, something about his mother's rabbit stew, the one she used to burn on purpose because she said charcoal was good for the teeth. And then the shell came in. I didn't hear it. You never hear the one that finds you. I only felt the concussion slam into the trench wall behind me and the sudden strange silence that follows a blast. The kind of silence where your ears have forgotten how to work and the whole war goes quiet for a heartbeat. Just long enough for you to realize something has happened to someone. That someone was my closest friend. The one I had enlisted beside. The one who had shared his last cigarette with me 4 hours earlier and told me with absolute certainty that we were both going to walk out of this war and open a small bakery together in whatever was left of our town. He said it like a man reading a weather report, like the future was already written and he had simply glanced at it. He was in my arms now, and there was no more future in him. I want to be precise about this because I was not a boy given to visions. I was 23 years old. 2 years of trench rotation. I had buried more men than I could count on both hands twice over. I had stopped believing in neat endings the first winter, when I watched the lieutenant I admired die of an infection from a scratch on his wrist. A scratch. After that, I filed God into the same drawer where I kept my pre-war certainties, and I locked the drawer and I threw the key into the mud, and I got on with the business of staying alive 1 more hour. I was not a man who expected to be surprised by anything ever again. And then, the ground under my boots stopped feeling like ground. There was no bright light yet. No tunnel, no music. Just the sudden, impossible awareness that I was being lifted. Not by hands, not by a blast, but by something gentler than gravity and stronger than grief. And that, my friend, who was dead in my arms, was being lifted with me. I'm going to tell you what I saw in the minutes that followed. And I'm going to tell you why, more than a century after a war most of the world has forgotten, I am finally allowed to tell it at all. The trench did not disappear. That is the part no one ever gets right when they try to describe these things. It did not fade. It simply stopped containing me. The way you might stop wearing a shirt that no longer fits. The shirt still exists. It is still in the room. But it is no longer part of you. I was still there and I was above. Both. Simultaneously. I could see my body kneeling in the bottom of the trench, cradling the body of my friend. My own face streaked with something that was half mud and half tears. And I could also see the back of my own head from a height of perhaps 20 feet, looking down with the calm curiosity I had not felt since I was a child sitting by a river. There was no pain. I want to emphasize this because I had been in almost constant physical pain for 2 years. The cold, the lice, the sores on my feet from boots that never fully dried, the ringing in my ears from the artillery, and all of it was simply gone. Not numbed, not suppressed, erased, the way a word is erased from a blackboard. The erasure itself was so absolute that I only noticed the pain's absence later, like a man who realizes halfway through a quiet afternoon that a dog that had been barking next door for years has finally stopped, and something else stopped with it. Time. Not the ticking of it. There was no ticking here to begin with, but the weight of it. The trench war had been a machine for making time feel heavy. Every second between shell bursts, every minute between rations, every hour of watch duty. Each of them had sat on my chest like a stone. I had been breathing under the accumulated mass of 2 years of measured seconds. Up here, or wherever here was, the stones were lifted. Time was no longer a thing that pressed down. It was simply gone from the equation. The way a room suddenly goes silent when someone finally turns off a motor you hadn't realized was humming. And next to me, still rising, was my friend. But not the version of him I had just been holding. He was whole. The wound that had taken him, the ragged, catastrophic thing that had been my last image of him, was simply not there. And it wasn't that the wound had been healed the way a doctor heals a cut. It was that the wound had never been part of who he actually was. Do you understand the distinction I'm trying to make? The body lying in the mud below us was real. It had carried him faithfully through 24 years of living. But it had been a uniform, not a self. And what I was seeing beside me now was him without the uniform. His face. His real face. Not young, not old. Somehow both and neither. Lit from within by a quality I had never seen in any living person, and which I can only describe as rightness, as if every molecule of him had finally agreed with every other molecule of him about what he was for. He turned his head toward me and he smiled. Not the tired half smile of the trenches, not the forced grin he used to give the younger recruits to keep their nerves steady. A smile so full of relief, it nearly knocked me sideways. The smile of a man who has just finished a 40-mile march and has finally taken his pack off. And then he looked up, and I looked up with him. I was not prepared for what was there. There was no ceiling to the sky. I had lived my whole life under a sky that ended somewhere. Clouds, stars, the blue dome of a summer afternoon. And I had simply assumed that was how skies worked. This one had no end. It opened and opened and opened, the way a door opens into a hallway that leads into a larger hallway that leads into a hall so vast you realize the door you came through was not a door at all, but a keyhole. And pouring down out of that endless opening was a light that had no source I could locate. A light that was not coming from anywhere because it was simply the nature of the place. The way water is the nature of the ocean. The light did not hurt my eyes. It did something far stranger. It hurt my pretending. Every small lie I had ever told myself to get through the war. I'm fine. It doesn't matter. I don't feel anything anymore. None of this counts. Each of those lies lit up inside me like pieces of paper held near a candle, and each of them curled and blackened and fell away. And what was left underneath was a version of me I had been hiding from for 2 years. And below the light, below us, I could see something that the shell and the mud had been covering up the whole time. A field, an open field, where the trench had been. But not as the trench was, as the field would be again. I saw it, and I need you to understand this is the part my old scientific friends would call impossible. And I don't care, because I saw it with a clarity that no waking sight in my life has ever matched. I saw that same stretch of cratered, poisoned, wire-tangled ground restored. Grass so green it seemed to be alive in a new way, as if every blade had been individually sung into existence. Trees standing in places where trees had been blown to splinters 100 times over. And people, thousands of people, rising out of the grass as though the grass had been a blanket and they had only been sleeping beneath. IT, rising. Opening their eyes, looking at each other like children who had just woken up on a summer morning and remembered that there is no school today. Some of them I recognized. Men I had seen die. Men I had carried on stretchers. Men I had shared cigarettes and jokes and fear with, and then stopped sharing anything with because the war had taken them. They were whole, every one of them. Not the versions they had been when the shells found them, not bleeding, not broken, not missing the pieces the guns had taken. They were themselves at their fullest, strong, upright, radiant in a way I had never imagined a human body could look. Men who had died as old, exhausted officers were now standing tall in the prime of their strength. Men who had died as young boys who never got to grow into anything were somehow both those same boys and simultaneously complete, as if whatever they were supposed to have become had finally been allowed to bloom. And they were running toward each other, not toward me. I need to be careful here, because I am describing something and I want to describe it honestly, not specifically toward anyone I could name. They were running across the restored field toward one another the way children run at the end of a long school day when the doors finally open, arms wide, faces lit with a joy that had waited so long it had fermented into something purer than joy. I saw mothers lifting infants out of the grass. Infants they had never held before, babies who had been lost before they were ever carried in open arms. And the mothers' faces were not faces I have words for. I saw old men and old women being met by the children of their youth. I saw husbands finding wives they had outlived by decades, and wives finding husbands they had outlived by a single terrible week. But the thing that made me go still, that made the air leave me in a way my body wasn't even using to breathe anymore, was something smaller than all of that. It was something that moved through the field like a current of happiness with 4 legs. The animals, They came pouring across that field in a river of life that no war had ever seen. Dogs. Farm dogs, shepherd dogs, little scruffy strays. Galloping through the grass with their ears streaming behind them, weaving through the crowd, pressing their noses into any palm that reached down to meet them. Horses. And you have to understand what that meant to a man who had watched cavalry horses die in the mud by the hundreds. Horses running with their manes catching the light, untouched, unbroken, no bits in their mouths, no harness marks on their backs. They moved among the people, not seeking any one person, but bringing their joy to everyone at once. The way a breeze carries its coolness to every face in a crowd without picking favorites. I saw cats threading through ankles. I saw birds landing on outstretched arms the way birds had not trusted human arms in centuries. The whole creation was at peace with itself. Every creature in the field existed in perfect accord with every other creature, and there was no fear between any of them, and no hunger, and no hierarchy of predator and prey. Just a shared, enormous aliveness that poured itself out over everything that moved. I watched it, floating. And beside me, my friend watched it with the face of a man who was already halfway home. And then, without warning, the vision turned its face toward me. I don't mean that literally. There was no figure, no voice, no pointing finger, but the entire scene seemed to notice me noticing it. And in that noticing, something began to ask me a question I had spent 2 years in a trench specifically so I wouldn't have to answer. What have you been living for? Not what had I been dying for. That part was easy. I could have given you a country, a flag, a line on a map, but what had I been living for in the hours between the shells? In the quiet moments in the billet, in the letters I didn't write home, in the conversations I cut short because I didn't want to seem soft. What had I been building inside myself during all those small, unwatched moments? And the answer came back with a clarity that was worse than any court-martial. Nothing. I had been building nothing. I had been surviving. I had been existing in the present tense as a defensive posture because the present tense was the only place the war couldn't touch. And I had confused that survival with a way of living. I had told myself I was being hard because the war required hardness. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I had been hard because I was afraid that if I ever let myself be soft again, I would find out how much I had already lost, and the finding out would kill me more efficiently than any shell. I had a mother at home. I hadn't written her in 4 months. Not because I didn't love her, because I did. And I couldn't bear to put the love into words that a censor would read. So I had written nothing, which she would have read as indifference. And indifference was not what I meant. I had meant protection. I had been protecting her from my fear by pretending not to have any. And I had a friend, the friend still floating beside me, whom I had teased more than I had thanked, who had given me half his rations more than once, who had covered my watch when I was coughing too hard to stand. I had never once said the plain sentence out loud, "You are the reason I am still here." I had assumed there would be time. There had not been time. The thing the light was showing me, without a single word being spoken, was that my life, whatever portion of it remained, was not a problem to be survived. It was a letter being written by my choices, and most of my pages so far had been blank. My friend turned to me one last time. He did not speak. He didn't have to. The look on his face said, "This is my road now. I have reached my stop." And then, gently, the way you might nudge a sleeping child off your shoulder when you need to stand up, he was released from me. I watched him rise higher. Not pulled, not dragged, moved the way a leaf is moved when it finally stops resisting the current of the river it was always going to follow. His face was lit by the approaching light, and the last expression I saw on him was not fear and not grief and not longing. It was arrival. The face of a man who had been walking for a very long time and had finally seen his own front door. And I was stopped. Not violently. There was no wall, no hand pushing me back, just a soft, absolute knowledge that this is not your doorway yet. My friend had reached his. Mine was somewhere farther down a road I had not yet walked, and the vision began to fold itself away. Not disappearing exactly, but being placed inside me. The way you fold a letter and slip it into a pocket you are not going to open again for years. The last thing I felt before I returned was the weight of something being given to me. Not a task exactly, not an order, a charge. The kind of weight you feel when someone presses something precious into your hand and closes your fingers around it without a word. And then I was back in my body, in the mud, with my dead friend still in my arms and my lungs seizing on the first breath I had taken, in what might have been a minute or might have been an hour. The ringing in my ears was back. The cold was back. My feet were back in their wet boots. The pain of the world poured into me all at once, the way cold water pours into a capsized boat. But I was not weeping anymore. One of the other men in the trench, an older corporal who had seen everything this war could do and had stopped flinching at any of it, was staring at me. He had seen my face change. He didn't ask what had happened. He only said, very quietly, in a voice I had never heard him use, "Lad." Something just left him. I saw it. I nodded. I did not trust my voice yet. I laid my friend down with a gentleness that surprised me, because my hands for 2 years had only known how to grip rifles and stretchers. And I sat beside him until the stretcher bearers came. And I did not feel the thing I was supposed to feel, which was the bottomless terror of watching a best friend die. I felt something else entirely. Something I had no category for at the time, and only learned to name years later when I was an old man sitting by a different kind of window. The word is relief. Not my relief, though mine came later. His. I had felt the relief pouring off him as he rose. The relief of a man who had finally been allowed to put his pack down. I survived the war. I won't pretend I survived it gracefully. I drank too much for a decade. I jumped at loud noises for 2. I woke my wife up more nights than I can count. But the thing I saw in that trench never left me. It sat inside me the way a coin sits in the lining of a coat pocket. Hidden, almost forgotten, but there every time I reached in. I'm telling you now because I'm old, and because the people I loved most have gone on ahead of me one by one. And because a long life has taught me that the thing I was shown on that field is the only thing I ever learned in the trenches that was worth bringing home. Listen to me carefully, because I don't have many words left and I want each of them to count. If someone you love has gone, a parent, a child, a husband, a wife, a friend who knew the shape of your silences, they are not lost in some vague place. They are not wandering. They are not alone. They are resting. A rest so deep and so merciful that the years you spend missing them are, for them, nothing at all. Not a waiting room, not a long night, not a period of any kind. Their last breath in this life and their first breath in the restored one will feel, to them, like 2 halves of the same moment. Like closing a door in one room and opening a door in another without any hallway in between. And the field I saw is real. The run-in is real. The reunions are real. The wholeness is real. I don't have the language of the seminary or the laboratory. I have the language of a soldier who held a dying friend in the mud and was shown, for reasons I will never deserve, a glimpse of where the story was actually going. And where it is going is home. The only thing I have left to tell you is this. Whatever years you have, don't spend them the way I spent my 20s. Hardened on purpose, closed on purpose, afraid to be soft because the world was hard. Spend them reaching, quietly and stubbornly, for the one who designed that field. Not through any particular building, not under any particular banner, not in the exact way your neighbor does it, but with a daily, honest hunger to know the Creator who made all of it possible, and to live in a way that would make Him recognize you on that morning. That is the whole of the task. Everything else is smaller than it looks. I am old now. I am not afraid. When my doorway comes, I know who will be standing just past it, with a face lit the way his face was lit in the mud, smiling the way he smiled at the sky. And I know what he will say, because I know him. And I know what he has been waiting the whole time to say. What kept you, friend? Come on, the bread is still warm. Tell me in the comments, whose face are you hoping to see on that morning? And what is the first sentence you want to say to them? I will read every single one.